Summer, 1945. Southern England. Dawn light spilled across the fog-soaked runways of RAF East Wretham as a strange noise rolled through the sky. Not a roar, not a scream, but something in between, a sound no one had ever heard before. Radar stations along the coast went wild. Blips shot across the screens faster than the operators could track. One sergeant leaned in, swore under his breath, and muttered, "That can't be right. It's doing over 700. Outside, ground crews ran from their tents, shielding their ears as a silver streak ripped through the clouds at an angle too steep to be survivable. The shockwave hit a second later, shattering windows, rattling fuel drums, and sending 1,000 pigeons into the air. No jet had been scheduled to fly that morning. No Allied aircraft on record could move that fast. Yet the thing that tore overhead wasn't German, and it wasn't a jet. It was something older, louder, a prop-driven fighter screaming past the edge of physics, a P-51 Mustang, except this one didn't sound right. It didn't even look right. Its exhaust trails glowed white-hot, the engine shrieking far beyond its rated limits. The wings shimmered in the heat haze, vibrating like a bowstring under tension. The tower scrambled a call. "Unidentified aircraft, identify yourself. You're exceeding safety altitude." No answer. Only the howl. Inside that cockpit, Lieutenant Don Hughes wrestled the stick, face contorted under G-forces. The dials were useless. The airspeed indicator jammed at its maximum, the altimeter spinning. He wasn't sure if the plane was flying or falling, only that it was going faster than any Mustang ever had. And somewhere down below, the man who had built this monster, Sergeant Frank Mallory, stood on the tarmac, hands black with oil, watching the contrail arc across the morning sky. His fellow mechanics gawked in disbelief. One yelled, "What the hell did you put in that thing?" Mallory just grinned. "Something I wasn't supposed to." The sound kept climbing, piercing, then faded into silence. A moment later, a distant boom rolled across the countryside. The first time a piston engine had ever kissed the edge of Mach 1. When Hughes finally leveled out, his canopy was cracked, his gauges were dead, and half the paint on the Mustang's nose had peeled clean off. But the plane was still flying. He whispered into the dead radio, voice shaking, "Tell Mallory, she just hit 720. Back at the base, officers stared at radar logs, trying to make sense of what they'd seen. Every law of aerodynamics said a P-51 couldn't go that fast. Every manual said the engine should have torn itself apart. But that morning, one outlaw mechanic had made the impossible real. And before the military could bury it, for one fleeting minute, the world had heard the sound of forbidden speed, the scream of an illegal engine that outflew physics itself. To understand how insane that flight really was, you have to understand what every engineer, pilot, and physicist in 1945 believed to be true. Propeller-driven planes had a wall, an invisible, unforgiving barrier called compressibility. Once the air flowing over the prop tips neared the speed of sound, everything started to break down. Air stopped behaving like air. Shock waves formed along the blades, the wings lost lift. The controls froze, and the aircraft could literally tear itself apart. That wall lived around Mach 0.8, roughly 530 to 540 mph at altitude. And for piston fighters, it was death's speed limit. Every aircraft manual hammered it home. Do not exceed red line. Structural integrity cannot be guaranteed. The P-51 Mustang, the crown jewel of American engineering, had a top speed of 437 mph in level flight. In a dive, under perfect conditions, maybe 505. Anything faster, and the plane would begin to shake itself to death. So when radar picked up a propeller aircraft breaking 700 mph, it wasn't just shocking, it was impossible. Back in the hangars, even the most hardened crew chiefs shook their heads. If he hit 720, one said, then he hit the afterlife. But Sergeant Frank Mallory didn't believe in limits written by other men. He was the kind of mechanic who saw rules as suggestions and physics as a dare. To him, engines weren't defined by their manuals. They were living things, full of hidden potential. He didn't trust equations. He trusted instinct. To most engineers, airflow was a science. To Mallory, it was music. He could tell by the sound of a Merlin V1650's idle whether the fuel mixture was too rich, by the pitch of its growl, whether the spark timing was off. While others used gauges, he used his fingertips. And what he'd noticed, long before that record-breaking morning, was that the Mustang's mighty Merlin engine wasn't reaching its true rhythm. It was being strangled by its own regulations, specifically by the boost restrictor, a device that capped how much air the supercharger could force into the cylinders. The reason was safety. Beyond 61 inches of manifold pressure, the risk of detonation skyrocketed. The pistons could melt, the engine could explode, and the pilot could die. Mallory's opinion? That's not overboosting, that's underbelieving. He'd watched men die in the sky, not because their engines failed, but because they couldn't escape. Outclimbed and outrun by German jets that could simply vanish into altitude. The Me-262 wasn't just faster, it was untouchable, and to Mallory, that was unacceptable. So while most men went to the mess hall after their shifts, Mallory stayed in the hangar, late nights, empty coffee cans, blueprints spread across the floor like battle maps. He wasn't trying to break records, he was trying to break rules. He believed that if he could rewire the supercharger bypass, feed the Merlin with the right high-octane blend, and free the intake from its factory restrictions, the Mustang could cross the wall that terrified engineers. Everyone called it suicide. He called it Tuesday. And deep down, he wasn't just fixing engines. He was chasing something else. The sound no one had ever heard. The moment where machinery stopped following men and started defying gravity. Because for Mallory, that was the real limit. Not physics, but fear. Frank Mallory didn't look like the kind of man who could rewrite the laws of flight. He wasn't a Harvard-trained engineer, didn't wear polished boots or carry a clipboard. He was tall, rough, and carried a permanent smear of oil across his cheek, the kind that never fully washed out. His hands were scarred from engine burns, his accent pure Kansas dirt, and his faith was built on busted metal that refused to quit. He'd grown up on a wheat farm outside Wichita, fixing tractors long before he ever saw a plane. His father once told him, "If you can't buy a new part, build one." That line stuck. By 16, he could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. By 20, he was breaking speed records on farm trucks he wasn't supposed to modify. When the war came, he joined the U.S. Army Air Forces, not as a pilot, but as a grease monkey. Pilots fly 'em, he'd say, but mechanics make 'em worth flying. By 1944, he'd been stationed at RAF East Wretham, maintaining P-51Ds for the 359th Fighter Group. To most of the men there, he was either a genius or a lunatic. He'd work alone long after curfew, tools clanging in the dark, his silhouette lit by a single bulb in the hangar. If an engine was overheating, he'd strip it down to the bolts. If a plane came back riddled with holes, he'd patch it with tin, chewing gum, and curses, and somehow it would fly better than before. He had a reputation among pilots. Mallory's birds don't die easy. But there was something about him that unsettled the brass. He didn't trust manuals. He didn't fill out repair forms. He made his own parts from scrap. When told his modifications were non-compliant, he grinned and said, "So's winning." By winter, pilots started seeking him out for the dangerous stuff, the extra edge that might mean the difference between life and death. They'd show up at his hangar at night with a flask of whiskey and a whisper, "Mallory, can you make her climb faster?" He always could. Then came the day that changed everything, January 1945. A squadron of P-51s was ambushed over Germany by Me-262 jets. 3 Mustangs were shot down before the Germans even made their second pass. The survivors came back white-faced, shaken. One pilot threw his helmet on the ground and shouted, "We might as well be flying biplanes." That night, Mallory stared at a half-dismantled Merlin engine in the hangar and whispered, "There's more in you." I know there is. He studied airflow diagrams stolen from a crashed Spitfire, noticed how its supercharger configuration allowed higher compression ratios without blowback. Then, without authorization, he began merging components, British designs, American parts, and raw instinct. When a fellow mechanic warned him he'd get court-martialed, Mallory smiled that crooked grin. Only if I fail. He didn't call what he was building a modification. He called it a resurrection. He was creating a hybrid engine, a Frankenstein Merlin that could inhale more air, drink more fuel, and scream louder than anything alive. No blueprints, no tests. Just a man, a wrench, and a dare against the impossible. To understand what Mallory was really fighting against, you have to picture the brutal math of flight at the edge of existence. The P-51D Mustang was a masterpiece, sleek, balanced, armed to the teeth, but it had already reached the end of what engineers thought a piston engine could do. At 25,000 feet, air thinned into silk. A standard Merlin V1657 engine produced roughly 1,490 horsepower at full military power, but above 28,000, even with its two-stage supercharger screaming, that number fell by nearly half. Every extra foot of altitude was a war against oxygen. Pilots reported the same pattern: push the throttle too far, and the manifold pressure needle would spike, the engine would cough, then detonate. The propeller tips, spinning faster than the speed of sound, created shock waves that shredded efficiency. At roughly Mach 0.78, the whole aircraft began to tremble, as if it were trying to shake itself apart. Physics was the wall, and every manual, every classroom, every Wright Field directive repeated the same sermon. No propeller aircraft will ever break the transonic barrier. Mallory read that line once, underlined it with a greasy thumb, and muttered, "Then we'll stop using propellers the way they expect us to." He didn't have the math of a designer, but he had something rarer: feel. He noticed that when he retimed the Merlin's magnetos just slightly off synchronization, the sound deepened, almost like the engine was breathing easier. He realized the factory fuel mixture, balanced for reliability, was choking the engine at high altitude. The problem wasn't the Merlin's strength, it was its restraint. The U.S. command had strangled the beast to protect the pilots from their own engines. Meanwhile, the enemy had no such fear. German jet pilots were hitting 540 mph in the Me-262. The Allies had nothing that could match it. To Mallory, it wasn't a contest of technology anymore. It was a contest of courage. "They've got jets," he'd tell his crew. "We've got nerve." He started running his own numbers on a scrap of cardboard. If the Mustang could safely hold 61 inches of manifold pressure, then doubling airflow with a modified supercharger and enriching fuel could push it past 100 inches for maybe 30 seconds before the pistons melted. 30 seconds. That's all he needed. He scavenged a damaged Spitfire's two-stage compressor from a salvage yard, studied its bypass geometry, and realized he could mate its impeller housing to the Merlin's intake if he bored out the coupling flange by hand. It wasn't precise, it was dangerous, but it worked. When another mechanic warned him, "You'll blow it sky high," Mallory laughed. "Then I'll have found the limit we've been guessing at." He started calling his creation the illegal Merlin, a living experiment in defiance. Every modification added risk. Every bolt brought him closer to discovery. By the spring of '45, he'd done it. A hybrid engine that could feed itself air faster than its prop could throw it away. The Mustang's polished nose now hit a ticking time bomb of torque and superstition. Mallory stood back, wiped the sweat from his neck, and whispered, "There's more to speed than science. Sometimes you just have to make the sky nervous." The mechanics who watched him work didn't understand the calculations. They didn't need to. They understood the look in his eyes, the kind men get before they do something that changes everything. And somewhere between math and madness, the rules of flight began to crack. It happened on a cold March morning in 1945. The sky over East Wretham was brittle and pale, the kind of morning that made engines wheeze before they roared. Mallory stood under his modified P-51D, tail number Daisy Bell, while the pilot, Lieutenant Jack Hughes, climbed into the cockpit, still buttoning his gloves. Hughes wasn't a believer in miracles. He was a straight-arrow officer, the kind who followed orders and trusted the manual more than men. But today, he was trusting Mallory. The mechanic slapped the side of the cowling and yelled, "Remember, she breathes fast now. Don't choke her." "Define choke," Hughes shot back. Mallory grinned. "You'll know." As the starter motor whined, the Merlin coughed once, then screamed alive. The sound was different, deeper, meaner, like thunder compressed into metal. Ground crewmen turned to look. One shouted, "What the hell did you do to it?" Mallory just said, "I let it breathe." Hughes taxied down the frozen tarmac, pushing the throttle. The nose dipped, the tail lifted, and the modified Mustang leapt forward as if yanked by an invisible hand. Within seconds, it was airborne, climbing almost vertically. At 10,000 feet, Hughes radioed down. "Throttle responses hot. Feels twitchy." Mallory replied from the hangar mic. "Ease her up to 25,000. Then open her lungs." No one had ever tested a Mustang like this. As Hughes climbed, the air thinned, the sound of the propeller sharpened, and the controls stiffened. He glanced at the manifold pressure gauge, already past 80 inches. "Mallory," he said, "you realize this is suicide, right?" "Only if you stop," came the reply. Hughes leveled out at 30,000 feet. From that altitude, the English coast looked like a toy map. Thin ribbons of smoke rising where factories worked to feed the war machine below. Then he pushed the throttle past redline. The effect was immediate. The Mustang didn't accelerate so much as detonate forward. The world outside blurred. The altimeter spun like a roulette wheel. Air began to shear off the fuselage, buffeting the wings in violent tremors. At 35,000 feet, Hughes hit Mach 0.83. The plane began to shudder. Control stick locked. Every bolt screamed. The propeller tips went supersonic, forming shock cones that danced in silver halos around the spinner. "Speed's off the charts!" Hughes shouted. Down below, Mallory and his crew stared at the radar return. It had just punched through 680 miles, then 700. Inside the cockpit, Hughes' vision blurred from vibration. Panels rattled loose. A section of his canopy cracked from pressure differential. He shouted, "She's coming apart!" "Ride it out!" Mallory yelled. Seconds later, the airflow stabilized, the vibrations softened. Against all logic, the Mustang leveled out, smooth again. 30,000 feet, Mach 0.9, Hughes said, voice trembling. "Holy hell, she's still climbing." Mallory stood motionless. Around him, every mechanic was silent, watching the radar blip crawl into the impossible. 720 kilometers per hour. For 6 heartbeats, the Mustang flew beyond what science allowed. No one spoke. No one dared breathe. Then Hughes throttled back, nose down, letting the aircraft drift back into reason. When he landed, the paint on the nose had blistered. The propeller edges were scored like razors, but the engine, the illegal Merlin, was still humming. Hughes climbed out, shaking. "Mallory," he said, "that wasn't flying. That was falling with intent." The mechanic smirked. "Told you she could breathe." The next morning, the hangar smelled like burnt oil and cold metal. Daisy Bell sat on her landing gear like a survivor of something holy and forbidden. Her cowling streaked with soot, rivets rattled loose, and exhaust ports glowing faint blue. Word spread fast. Within an hour, officers from 3 different commands showed up. Clipboard men in pressed uniforms and suspicion in their eyes. They surrounded the plane like priests at an exorcism. Major Harlan, head of maintenance for the 359th Fighter Group, barked first. "Who authorized this configuration?" Mallory didn't even look up from wiping his wrench. She authorized herself. "Don't get cute, Sergeant. This isn't a workshop. It's government property. You just risked an aircraft and a pilot without clearance." Mallory tossed the rag aside. "He landed, didn't he?" The officers exchanged looks. Someone muttered, At 700 miles an hour. That's when the questioning turned formal. Mallory was brought into a tent lined with paper, maps, and too many angry faces. A typist sat in the corner, ready to record the confession. "Sergeant Mallory," Major Harlan began, "you are hereby charged with unauthorized modification of aircraft components, misuse of restricted materials, and endangering U.S. Army Air Force's property. Do you understand the charges?" Mallory crossed his arms. "I understand you're mad she went faster than you thought possible." The major slammed his fist on the table. "This isn't a joke." "No, sir," Mallory said evenly. "This is proof." Silence. Finally, one of the younger officers spoke, a flight engineer from Wright Field. He looked pale, almost reverent. "Sir, if I may, I've reviewed the telemetry. The manifold pressure readings shouldn't even be possible, but they are. And the propeller efficiency passed Mach .83. It didn't disintegrate. It harmonized." The room shifted. Men leaned forward. Mallory leaned back in his chair, arms behind his head. "She just wanted to fly the way she was built to." Major Harlan rubbed his temples. "You realize this engine violates every regulation in the manual." Mallory shrugged. "Maybe the manual's wrong." The Wright Field engineer stood. "Sir, I recommend this not be treated as an infraction, but an experiment. If replicated, this could rewrite our understanding of air compression at altitude." Harlan glared. "You're suggesting we endorse this insanity?" The engineer's voice steadied. "No, sir. I'm suggesting we study it before the Germans beat us to it." That saved him. The court-martial was quietly dissolved. No paperwork, no reprimand. Just silence. The kind that smells like secrecy. Mallory returned to his hangar that evening alone. Someone had left a note on the workbench, unsigned. "The sky bends for those who dare it." He smiled. It wasn't approval, but it was enough. He ran his hand along the fuselage of Daisy Bell. "You and me, girl," he whispered. "We scared them good." A few weeks later, a sealed order arrived from the upper brass. No further unauthorized testing. Engine impounded for technical review. They grounded his creation, but they couldn't bury what it proved. Mallory had touched the ceiling of physics and come back alive. The men who laughed at him now stared at his empty hangar like a shrine. And somewhere high above, the sky remembered the day a piston engine made it tremble. 2 weeks later, Mallory's hangar sat empty except for oil stains and cigarette burns. The scars of brilliance and insubordination. His beloved Daisy Bell was gone, crated up and hauled to Wright Field under guard. No one told him why. They didn't have to. He knew what was coming. They were going to take her apart. Every nut, every bolt, every spark plug he'd hand-filed to perfection. His miracle engine would be stripped to the bone, catalogued and sterilized by men who'd never smelled jet fuel in their sleep. Mallory lit a cigarette and muttered, "They'll never hear her sing." At Wright Field, the nation's best engineers descended on the crate like vultures over treasure. The first man to pry open the cowling was Dr. Banya's Clarence Kelly Johnson, Lockheed's wunderkind, the mind behind the P-38 Lightning, and the soon-to-be SR-71. He stared into the hybrid Merlin and said softly, "What the hell did this man do?" The others gathered. The data tags made no sense. The magneto timing had been offset by exactly 2.5 degrees. The fuel injection ratio had been modified beyond factory safety limits. And the Spitfire compressor grafted onto the manifold. It wasn't welded. It was hand-lathed to fit. Mallory's mix of precision and madness fascinated them. One engineer remarked, "This isn't luck. This is intuition on fire." They tested the engine on a dynamometer. The readings nearly broke the equipment. The illegal Merlin peaked at 2,250 horsepower at altitude simulation, a full 60% higher than the official rating. It didn't stall. It didn't detonate. It howled. They tried to replicate it in a controlled environment. They couldn't. Every lab-built version tore itself apart. Only Mallory's patchwork monster survived the test cycle. That was when the rumors began, that the crazy mechanic from Suffolk had stumbled onto something even Rolls-Royce hadn't mastered: dynamic self-cooling under supercharged compression. Within a month, his modifications were quietly coded into experimental blueprints labeled Project Scorpion. These would later inform the earliest tests of the Allison J-33 jet, the same engine that powered the P-80 Shooting Star. But Mallory's name was nowhere on the paperwork, not even a footnote. Back in England, he received a single letter stamped confidential. It read, "Your work has contributed to ongoing research into high-altitude propulsion. The details remain classified. Consider this acknowledgement your service to the future of flight." Mallory read it once, then burned it in an oil drum. He wasn't bitter, just tired. He walked back into the empty hangar and looked at the ceiling where Daisy Bell once hung in the air like a prayer. "They can have the numbers," he said quietly. "But the feeling, that was mine." In time, whispers spread. Engineers at Lockheed called his setup the Ghost Engine. Pilots who'd heard about it swore that somewhere, above 30,000 feet, the sky still carried the echo of that scream. Mallory never bragged, never wrote a patent. But in the months that followed, P-51s across Europe began receiving new high-altitude tuning kits, unofficially dubbed Mallory mods. He just smiled when he heard the name. Guess the sky remembers after all. Officially, the record said the test program ended in early April 1945. The modified engine had been disassembled for evaluation, its performance unverifiable. But there was one more flight, a mission that never made it into any archive, no logbook, no after-action report. Only stories whispered years later by pilots who swore they saw it. It started with a simple order: ferry a prototype P-51 from England to a forward airstrip in Belgium for testing. The pilot was Captain Jack Hughes, the same man who'd taken Daisy Bell into the stratosphere. But when he arrived at the hangar, something was off. The aircraft on the tarmac was painted a dull olive gray. No serial number, no markings. Its engine cowling bore the faint scorch marks of rewelded seams. Mallory was there, smoking his last cigarette. "Didn't think I'd see you again," Hughes said. Mallory smirked. "You're not supposed to. She isn't mine anymore." He glanced at the plane. "But she still sings the same way." "Is this—" Hughes began. Mallory cut him off. "She's got the heart, yeah. One more run, just to prove it wasn't luck." Moments later, the P-51 taxied out, its engine snarling through the mist. Mallory watched it rise into the dawn, a streak of silver vanishing into the cloud ceiling. At 20,000 feet, Hughes leveled off. The controls felt tighter this time, more refined, more lethal. He pressed the throttle forward. The new variant didn't lurch, it surged. The climb rate doubled, the altimeter spun. 25,000 feet, 30,000, then 35,000. On the ground, technicians inside the hangar tracked the flight path with radar. One of them gasped. "He's pulling 800 miles an hour." Mallory didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt history. Hughes' voice crackled over the radio. "Still steady, temps holding, she's not breaking up." Static, then another voice, excited, barely controlled. "Contact, enemy jet at 1 o'clock. They weren't supposed to be there, but German Me-262s were still active in scattered units over the continent, desperate and erratic. One appeared above the Belgian coast, heading straight for the P-51. Hughes didn't turn away. He climbed. Mallory gripped the radio, silent. At 38,000 feet, radar showed the two blips merge. For 30 seconds, they danced, one jet, one prop, twisting through thin air where nothing should have lived that fast. Then the German signal vanished. Hughes came back over the radio, breathless. "Mallory, she did it. I left him behind." He couldn't keep up. The crew in the hangar broke into cheers. Mallory said nothing, just exhaled a shaky breath. The Mustang landed 2 hours later, paint scorched, canopy cracked. Hughes climbed out, eyes wide. "You made a piston plane outrun a jet," Mallory smiled faintly. "No, son, she did." That flight was never filed. Officially, it didn't exist. The data vanished into military storage marked experimental performance record, restricted. But among the men who'd seen it, the story grew into legend. The day a backyard mechanic from Kansas had made gravity blink. And every pilot who took off after that, every engineer who dreamed of breaking the sound barrier, owed something to that unrecorded dawn over Belgium. It wasn't a fluke. It was a farewell. To piston engines, to propellers, to the machines that had carried humanity as far as courage could take it. Mallory's fix had been more than illegal. It had been immortal. When the war ended, the files on the illegal Merlin were sealed under a new classification. Advanced Propulsion Confidential, Category R. Mallory never saw them again. He was honorably discharged, no medals, no citations, just a handshake and a vague thank you letter that read, "Your contributions are appreciated." He went home to Kansas, traded his flight line wrench for a tractor spanner, and built a small repair shop on the edge of a wheat field. To the locals, he was just Old Ray, the quiet mechanic who could make anything with an engine run smoother than factory spec. But sometimes at night, when a piston coughed or a compressor whined, he'd pause, listening, as if hearing that impossible howl again, the one that had touched 720 Sunmarur and come back alive. He never spoke of it, not once. But the story didn't die. At Wright Field, a handful of engineers who'd worked on his confiscated engine moved on to new programs. Bell's X-1, North American's F-86 Sabre, Lockheed's P-80. They didn't mention his name in reports, but they whispered it in hangars. Mallory tuning. It became shorthand for reckless genius, for pushing a machine beyond fear until it sang. In 1947, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1, reporters asked how it felt. He said, like it was built by someone who stopped listening to the rule book. No one in the room knew that statement traced back to a nameless sergeant with a wrench and a dream. Years later, one of those Wright Field engineers visited Mallory's farm. He found the old mechanic in grease-stained overalls, rebuilding a tractor engine by hand. "Do you ever miss it?" the visitor asked. Mallory smiled faintly. "Miss what?" "The sky," the man said. Mallory stared out at the horizon. Endless blue above an ocean of wheat. "It's still up there," he said quietly. "Still waiting for the next fool to chase it." The engineer handed him a small package, a copy of a declassified report titled Propeller-Induced Shockwave Mitigation, Preliminary Study, 1945. On the last page, in faded ink, was a handwritten note. Original data derived from field modifications, 359th Fighter Group, Sergeant Raymond Mallory. Mallory traced the words with his thumb, eyes glinting in the afternoon sun. He didn't frame it. He didn't tell anyone. He just folded it up, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and went back to work. That night, a storm rolled in. Thunder shook the fields, lightning flashed, and for a second, just a heartbeat, he could have sworn he heard the sound of a Merlin engine roaring through the clouds. The war had ended, but the echo of defiance never did. Somewhere between science and stubbornness, between regulation and rebellion, Mallory had found something no lab could reproduce. The moment when man and machine become one defiant sound against the sky. And though history forgot his name, every supersonic engine that came after him whispered it in their own language, through heat, speed, and the scream of the impossible. Because once, in the final days of a dying war, one mechanic refused to obey physics, and for 720 miles an hour, he won. Decades later, the Kansas prairie looked no different. Endless wind, rusted mailboxes, barns faded by time. The war was just a chapter in a history book now. Jets crossed the sky daily, leaving contrails like white scars over the horizon. But one morning, an unfamiliar sound rolled across the fields, deep, throaty, alive. It was the sound of a Merlin engine, a restored P-51 Mustang, gleaming silver, red-nosed, circled low over Mallory's farm. The pilot dipped the wings once, respectfully, then banked into the wind and disappeared. No one in the town knew who the pilot was or why he'd flown that route. But the old mechanic sitting on his porch knew. He smiled, leaning back in his chair, eyes following the sky. "She still remembers," he whispered. The wind picked up, stirring the wheat like an ocean. And for a fleeting second, the sound of that Merlin merged with the memory of another, the one that had broken the edge of possibility. Mallory didn't leave a legacy of patents, medals, or memorials. What he left behind was something quieter but far more powerful. Proof that innovation isn't born from privilege, but from nerve. That sometimes the man with the fewest tools makes the biggest dent in the universe. His story never made it into textbooks, but among pilots and engineers, his myth endured. The mechanic who rewired the sky. Every generation since has produced its own Mallory, the kind of mind that looks at a limit and calls it a dare. From NASA's test bays to Silicon Valley's labs, the same principle echoes through every bold experiment. Don't ask if it's allowed. Ask if it works. And somewhere, far beyond the sound barrier, beyond what blueprints can predict and computers can model, the ghost of Mallory's engine still hums. A reminder that rules can define a plane, but only rebellion defines flight. The war may have ended 80 years ago, but that defiant hum, the sound of courage disguised as machinery, is still out there, threading through jet exhaust and thunder, whispering a single truth. Progress begins when someone stops asking permission.